the Stuart and Suzanne Grant Professor of the American Jewish Experience at Tulane University, and I direct the Grant Center for the American Jewish Experience. Tonight's book launch is part of Tulane's annual Biner Symposium, which unites leading scholars and practitioners from diverse fields, history, literature, sociology, journalism, and more, to engage in meaningful dialogue about the American Jewish experience. For the past 2 years, the symposium has brought historians and journalists together at the Center for Jewish History to situate pressing issues of our time within broader historical contexts, fostering conversations that are both rigorous and deeply relevant. We spent the day in conversation, and this event caps our symposium. And also for the second straight year, we are proud to be partnering with the American Jewish Historical Society, and their support has been instrumental in making this event a reality. Together, we're committed to expanding the boundaries of American Jewish studies, generating scholarship, fostering collaboration, and making knowledge accessible beyond the academy. We believe that creating spaces where scholars, journalists, and the public come together is essential not just for Jewish life, but for the health of our civil discourse. Thank you to Gemma Birnbaum and her team at AJHS for your work in supporting this really productive partnership. That work is made possible because of generous partners and supporters. So in addition to AJHS and the Center for Jewish History, I want to especially thank Laura and Jonathan Biner, as well as Stuart and Suzanne Grant, for making this work possible. If what you experienced tonight resonates with you, then I invite you to utilize the QR code on your program to join us in sustaining and growing this work. So this evening, we are honored to feature Professor Pamela Nadell, the Patrick Clendenen Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, past president of the Association of Jewish Studies, and one of the leading historians of American Jewish life. Her prize-winning book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the 2019 National Jewish Book Awards Everett Family Foundation Book of the Year. Her path-breaking and timely new book, Antisemitism, An American Tradition, which will be published next month by W.W. Norton. Yes, it's out in the back, but it has not officially come out yet. Offers a sweeping account of how anti-Semitism has shaped the American story across centuries through law, politics, violence, resistance, and resilience. And in conversation with Pamela is Franklin Foer, staff writer at The Atlantic, former editor of The New Republic, and author of several acclaimed books, including the recent The Last Politician, Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future, a New York Times bestseller, and How Soccer Explains the World, An Unlikely Theory of Globalization, which has been translated into 30 languages. He's also a winner of the National Jewish Book Award. Together, Pamela and Franklin will guide us through a conversation about how anti-Semitism has been both an enduring force and a changing one in American history, and what that means for us today. So Pamela, congratulations on this important new book. Franklin, thank you so much for being with us, and I'm going to turn it over to Andrew from the American Jewish Historical Society for a few logistical announcements.
Hello, good evening. Good evening and welcome to the American Jewish Historical Society. I am Andrew Sperling. I am the new historian and director of academic initiatives. We are very honored to be hosting this book talk event, Antisemitism, An American Tradition, co-sponsored by the Stuart and Suzanne Grant Center for the American Jewish Experience at Tulane University and the Center for Jewish History. In addition to those joining us in person, this program is also being live streamed to over 700 people across the country. Our conversation this evening features author Pamela Nadell, American University's Patrick Clendenen Chair in Women's and Gender History, as well as director of the Jewish Studies program. And she is joined by Franklin Foer, staff writer at The Atlantic. And just on a brief personal note, it's a very special honor for me to introduce Professor Nadell, who served as my dissertation advisor at American University. Yes. I had the chance to actually help her research this book by examining striking and often disturbing anti-Semitic illustrations held here in the AJHS archives. And even then, I knew she was on the brink of producing vitally important work. And as someone who has studied under Professor Nadell, I can say firsthand that her scholarship has profoundly shaped the way we engage with American Jewish history. This evening's conversation will also include a brief Q&A near the end of the discussion. So please write down any questions you wish to ask our guests on the note cards you received at check-in. You will be prompted when it is time to hand your note cards to AJHS staff. If you do not have a note card, please raise your hand, and our staff member will come and bring one to you. After the discussion, please also join us for refreshments and a book signing in the Great Hall. And now please welcome author Pamela Nadell and Franklin Foer.
You accomplished quite a feat with this book, because at the very end I was like, I can't get enough anti-Semitism. It sounds like your family was kind of like the rest of American Jewry after October 7th, that they'd greet you at the breakfast table and they'd be like, oh no, Mom, not more anti-Semitism. But I want to start by just asking you about an American tradition, because that is just such a striking thing to hear. Because when I think about America, I think about Washington's letter to the Newport Jews. I think about tolerance. I don't think about an American tradition. What were you aiming to get at with that?
And what you think about is the Golden Age, which you've written about, right?
All right, so I'm stuck in my tracks.
So the notion of traditions, our country has multiple traditions, right? We have a very powerful tradition of racism, and we have a very powerful tradition of anti-racism. And what jumped out at me in writing this book was how, because I started Colonial Times and I actually go up to the killings at the Capitol Jewish Museum last May, what jumped out at me is we have a tradition in America of anti-Semitism. We also have a tradition in America of philo-Semitism, but that's not the book that I was writing. And since my editor is here, I'm thrilled that Amy Cherry is here. She didn't even push back at me when I said, no, it is not a subtitle. It is not going after a colon. It is part of the title, because I didn't want the tradition to be lost.
You've empowered us all to push back against editorial colons. But what do we, it's a reframing in a way, right?
Right.
And what do you hope to convey by reframing it this way? What if, by setting the terms of the debate and the ways in which we've tended to set it, what have we lost? What do we gain by reminding ourselves of this tradition?
The first thing is that there had not been a good book on the history of American anti-Semitism since 1994. And that was an excellent book, but that's 30 years, right?
It's incredible. Let's just pause there. It's been 30 years since there's been an important book about America.
A really good book on, an overview of the history
and
of
why
America.
Was there that long period of abatement?
Well, you tell me, because of the Golden Age, right? I'm going to keep coming back to that. But there was the sense that we had moved past anti-Semitism in American life, certainly, and that, and then we began to see the changes. So I think that's the first thing is what had happened there. And then there's really what happens is this is a 2018 book, right? It's right after the Tree of Life. We're actually meeting here. The historians are meeting under the auspices of the American Jewish Historical Society. I'm sitting in my study in Washington using some technology that I don't remember that links up to a camera in a room in this building. This is long before Zoom. And we're all going, how had we missed this story? And the people in that room, we'd written scores of books about all sorts of aspects of American Jewish history, but we had pretty much ignored anti-Semitism. And for me, those conversations were powerful. It was at that moment that I was just publishing my last book on America's Jewish women. I was doing a lot of book talks, and during those book talks, a historian of anti-Semitism, European anti-Semitism, turned to me and he said, anti-Semitism is all over that book. And I thought, no, you're crazy. That's not what I was writing about. I was writing about women who were activists and mothers. And then I went back and I looked at every chapter. I could not write a chapter of that book without talking about anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is constitutive of what it means to be a Jew. So it is a kind of reframing. I'm not ignoring those other histories, but it was time also to understand how anti-Semitism courses across the American Jewish experience and the forms it took.
I want to go into that experience, but before we do that, I just want to dwell for a second longer on this beat that this had fallen out of somehow academic fashion. What does it say about American Jewish studies that anti-Semitism as a topic just plummeted in the way that it had?
It says that scholars are just like
They're just like us.
right?
Hey,
Yeah.
Scholars, they're just like us.
Yeah,
I can start an Instagram feed.
Yeah, we live in the moment, right? So I was writing about women at a time where a lot of scholarship was being done on American women. So I'm living in the moment, and I'm not looking at subjects that don't seem to have any particular relevance.
Do you think, kind of in the American Jewish story, that there's part of anti-Semitism as an element, as a motif, that up until recently we haven't really wanted to delve into for some reason?
I think that we have, well, a couple of things. First of all, we didn't think we needed to dive into it until Charlottesville, right? I mean, I remember reading about some distinguished Jewish communal leader who saw Charlottesville like he was just shocked about what had happened. And I considered him very astute. And then I took out the word astute because he obviously was not that astute if he was missing all of that. So that's the first thing that happens. It's not that we were reluctant to encounter it. We just, and even I heard somebody say this, maybe you, this morning, it was on the fringes, and so therefore it wasn't serious. The problem is it was not only on the fringes. So we like to dismiss the fringes, like, oh, they're crazy anti-Semites. But there's lots of people out there in America who are not crazy anti-Semites. They're just anti-Semites.
Let's go back to earlier eras in American history. What was, in the early republic, what was anti-Semitism like?
What we have in the early republic is we have traditional Christian anti-Judaism, by and large. I mean, we begin to see by the 1830s, the Rothschilds are beginning to make a little bit of headway in America and using them as, the nefarious Jewish connivers who are manipulating governments and armies and, destroying the world. But by and large, it's that, it's Jews are not Christian. And therefore, they need to become Christian, right? The debate in American life about whether or not this is a Christian nation starts very early with the founding of the colonies and then the emergence of the country and continues down to today. You know this, you write about this.
Talk about one name from this era, the American Society Familiarizing the Condition of the Jews,
right.
was something that jumped out at me, because especially since John Quincy Adams was apparently one of the founding members or vice president.
He's listed as a vice president. Later on, he says he wasn't not vice president of the United States, vice president of the organization. Later on, he says he wasn't, but he has no memory. But he's on the founding documents, and so are lots of other prominent people from that moment. So the solution to the Jewish problem is, and has long been the solution to the Jewish problem, is they have to become Christian. So we begin to see the emergence of these various societies in England and in the United States to convert the Jews. And how do you solve the problems? You build colonies for them, and they work there, and then they get the kind of education they need in order to see the true light.
And then, to what extent is there, in the 19th century, something that we could describe as or maybe even further into the narrative, something we could describe as an indigenous tradition of American anti-Semitism? Or is the nature of American anti-Semitism, like so many other aspects of American life, something that needs to be considered in a transatlantic global context?
What do you think I'm going to say?
You're the one on the you're the one up here right now.
So we have to look at anti-Semitism in a global context. We can't look at it only in the United States. I mean, first of all, it's a nation of immigrants, and the immigrants are coming over. They're bringing over the ideas that they have from from Europe. They're listening to, I mean, you could read ministers' sermons, which are reported in the local newspapers, and so often, especially around Easter and Christmas, so often the things that they will say about the Jews would raise hair on your face or something. Yeah.
As you went back and you looked at the 19th century and the early Republic, were there aspects of American anti-Semitism or instances of it that surprised even you as as an American historian?
What surprised me as a historian also of American women is that when anti-Semitism begins to rise at the end of the 19th century, the early 1880s, that the loudest voices responding were two women. One, people know, Emma Lazarus. The other one, Nina Marias, later Nina Marias Cohen. Nobody had ever heard of except the historians. And they wrote very important pieces in mainstream American magazines about anti-Semitism and how to solve it, essentially. And I kept looking for male figures who would have been responding to this, and they're not. I actually, maybe it was even Andrew who did this research for me, but I had somebody go through a couple of years of those magazines to see who else was writing about that subject. And it made me wonder if there was something about women being not exactly in the public sphere in the same way that men were, that made it easier for them to push back against this.
Is there something in those early examples of pushback that would be useful for us to import into the present?
What's interesting in terms of importing into the present is that one author's solution, Nina Marias, says, if only...
Tell us just a little bit about who she is.
Oh, so Nina Marias was the daughter of a very important rabbi in Philadelphia, Sabato Marias, who was actually the first president of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And she doesn't marry till she's about 30. She becomes a teacher, following in the footsteps of her mother, but also her father, and also a writer who ends up really falling into obscurity, but in her moment in time, is widely seen in the Jewish community as an important writer. And she had written in the North Atlantic Review, an important magazine, she had written about a response around the women's rights movement. And then she writes that first, and then comes, and I don't know if she was requested to write this or she wrote it on her own and submitted it, but then comes to write this article about, and at this point it's still called the word anti-Semitism it's just emerged, it's really anti-Judaism at this point.
So we're in the 1880s?
It's 1881. And she writes this article, and her solution is we need to educate the world about the Jews, and then they won't hate us. And of course, Emma Lazarus's solution is that there needs to be a Jewish nation. And so they, in that sense, think of the solutions we've come up with in the 20th century and 21st century, right? Jewish state, and now a huge grant to educate. That the National Endowment of Humanities has given it the largest grant ever, and it's to educate the world, or at least Americans, about anti-Semitism. And I would say history doesn't bode well for either solution at this point.
Right. This is, sorry to stay in the 19th century, but I do find that this is like, it's a big gap in most American Jews' understanding of their own history. Was there a signature, could you pull out a signature anti-Semite from the 19th century? I know in the 20th century we would all gravitate to say Henry Ford or Father Coughlin or whatever. Lindbergh, we have these names we gravitate to instantly, but in the 19th century, it's harder to...
Yeah, I mean, we have the Seligman-Hilton affair when Joseph Seligman, who had, with his family, had typically stayed at the Grand Union Hotel in, I think it's 1877, and he's turned away by Judge Henry Hilton, but nobody's going to know the name Hilton. Nobody's going to remember that, and that becomes a huge national and also gets international attention. So we don't have something like the Dreyfus Affair in America in the 19th century, but it is that
Tell that story in a little bit more depth, because it is such an interesting one.
The Seligman one or the Dreyfus one? Seligman one?
Seligman one, I think we're familiar with Dreyfus.
Yeah, but so Seligman, he and his family were on a boat, and there was an accident in the boat, and they arrive at the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga Springs, and they're turned away, and they actually makes headlines, front page of the New York Times, front page of papers all around the country, of this exclusion, which historians ended up writing as social anti-Semitism, but is really a rejection of Jews from public accommodation, was actually a violation of civil rights law. And there are all sorts of questions about how to handle it. But what really jumped out at me when I was doing the research was something people had not paid a lot of attention to, and that was that there were long-standing policies at many hotels not to welcome Jews. And I think what jumps out at people in this period, because the moment is the East European Jews are just starting to flow into America, is that there was a sense that there would be opposition and animosity towards the poor immigrants who were coming in. But here's somebody who was a friend of President Ulysses S. Grant, and who was even offered the position of Secretary of the Treasury and turned it down. So, yeah.
What would you say what are the peak years, if we were to do the line graph of American anti-Semitism? When would you say the zeniths are?
So so historians have said that the years of the 1930s, some go back even between World War I and World War II, are the peak years of American anti-Semitism. They called it the high tide of American anti-Semitism. And since Tree of Life, if not since Charlottesville, I've been saying that I think we are living through a new high tide of American anti-Semitism, and the historians 50 years from now will have enough distance to write about our own moment, we'll have to rename that earlier period to call this era the high tide.
So we're going to return to the parallels with the present, and it's an extraordinary thing to hear you put it as flatly as you just put it.
Oh, I've been doing it for years, not just now.
Yeah. But let's talk about the 1930s for a little bit, and because even though I knew I'd heard a lot of, we know the context for the 1930s. We know about the rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan. We know about the Dearborn Independent. We know about Father Coughlin. We know about kind of some of the undercurrents of America First. But what was so shocking to me was when you just talked about the ways in which that actually touched all these corners of American life, especially in big cities. There was statistics you had from the Chicago Tribune.
Right.
It was something like 75% of the help wanted ads in the paper said that Jewish women need not apply.
Yeah.
Just paint the portrait of that moment for us.
We know about Henry Ford. I think people are familiar, like you said. They're familiar with Charles Coughlin. And they know about that there was economic discrimination. But I don't think there's a sense of how much that discrimination existed and how much it affected people's lives. So in those years, there was an organization called the American Jewish Congress. There was a rabbi named Jacob X. Cohen. The X is for the fact that he wanted to be distinctive, so he added the X to his name. Otherwise, there were a lot of Jacob Cohens. And his job was to investigate these discriminations and complaints. And so he and other people would go to employment offices. That's how people got jobs in those days. They went to an employment office, and the employment offices knew you would never send anybody who was Jewish to AT&T. They didn't hire anybody. And anybody who woke up in the morning and read their newspapers, if they were looking for a job and they read the want ads, they could see Christians only, or they could see no Jews apply. And it was so pervasive that, and I think American Jewish historians haven't paid enough attention to this, why did so many American Jews go into business, right? And run their mom and pop shops? Because they couldn't get any other jobs.
Right, to go to a professional school, to go to medical school, I think there was something about dentistry as well. In the book.
Dentistry.
You would have to go to Europe to get training.
Yeah, and then of course World War II breaks out and the gates are closed in terms of going to Europe. And so, and it was also university, like undergraduate university officials, they would tell their Jewish students that they had admitted under a quota, you know, you shouldn't plan on becoming a doctor because we're not going to be able to place you in medical school.
So I think in my telling and in a lot of the conventional telling, we get to this moment where World War II happens and anti-Semitism begins to melt away, yet that wasn't the case. And I was pretty, I knew that Yale and other places had lobbied to keep some of the quotas in place after the war, but just talk about Stanford and Johns Hopkins, which were, I think, examples that you had of places that kind of kept pursuing anti-Jewish policies even after the Holocaust, even after everything.
And they institute them after the war.
Yeah.
Johns Hopkins had a president who the faculty knew did not want to hire Jewish faculty, but then after the war, he institutes a quota when the other schools are beginning to think that maybe they're not going to be able to keep them any longer. And Stanford does the same thing because they realize that they're getting too many Jewish students from two particular high schools in Los Angeles. And so all of a sudden, the numbers of students they take from those high schools plummets. And this is in the 1950s. So we thought it disappeared.
Yeah.
It didn't disappear.
Well, what does that say about the American elite?
What it says about the American elite is, I think, the persistence of how much concern there remains about Jewish overrepresentation in elite institutions.
As you're studying all these episodes, and we see the ways in which there are these public figures, and oftentimes religious figures, sometimes politicians, who shape public opinion. How much of the currents of American anti-Semitism do you think can be explained by manipulative demagogues, and how much do you think that there's just this undercurrent that never really truly goes away, that's just waiting to be tapped and kind of ebbs and flows a little bit with the times, but it's kind of just always there?
So I think what you're asking me is about anti-Semitism and kind of an essentialist explanation.
I don't know if it's essentialist or not. I'm not saying that it's essentialist, but I'm saying it seems like when I read your book and I read it straight through, there are very few periods in American history where anti-Semitism really recedes, and it never recedes entirely. It's always present. There's some times where it's more present than others, but that also, I mean, in a way it does, it's not essentialist, it's just kind of a fact of American history.
Right, that's why it's a tradition. It's there, and it's a question of when it gets tapped. So we know that anti-Semitism rises in times of difficulty and crisis. And that anti-Semitism, as we were talking, some of us earlier today, anti-Semitism says something about the wider nation, about the culture, and it has nothing to do with the Jews. It really has to do with the issues that are going on in the wider culture. But you're right. I mean, first of all, I wasn't looking for periods when I couldn't find any anti-Semitism. That has to do with the nature of the project that I was working on. It's also, anti-Semitism morphs and changes over time. So one of the things that I write about in the period that, thanks to you, I call not an entirely golden age.
Okay, I get it.
But one of the things that I write about is the emergence of Holocaust denial, Holocaust deniers using college campuses to spout, their newspapers to spout their views, and then the debates that emerge over that, and then is it a question of free speech, or should they be able to print what they want to print in those newspapers? And that is, endemic across college newspapers in the 1990s.
I'm going to ask you an unfair question, but it's a question that gets asked, I'm sure will get asked of you at every stop on your book tour,
Okay.
and I think it's a question that gets asked of anybody who looks at these topics in the present day, which is that there is this deep urge that people have to say, is this a left-wing or a right-wing phenomenon? And I feel like your book implicitly has ways of resetting that question so that it can be considered in a more productive way.
Thank you. That's really nice.
But tell us how, because I feel like we're kind of, this is a trap that people fall into.
I mean, and the moment we're in right now, we're very polarized society, and one side is only looking at anti-Semitism coming from the other side, and the other side is only looking at anti-Semitism coming from the first side. And what we're seeing right now is anti-Semitism attacking Jews from both sides, even if the media is focusing more on one of the particular narratives. But the reality is that's why this moment is so much worse than the 30s, even though there were plots in the 30s to kidnap 25 Jews, prominent Jews in Hollywood, and string them all up, and then in the hopes that they would launch a nationwide pogrom, which would then align the United States with Nazi Germany. But in the 30s, there's relatively little anti-Semitism vocally coming from the American left. In fact, when it does, it kind of shocks the people on the left. But at the moment we're in right now, it's just battering Jews from both political sides.
Is it, I think there's, going back to the 1950s, there's a long-standing Jewish tradition, at least Jewish intellectual tradition, I think, to identify anti-Semitism with populism.
Right.
Having done this work, does that hold up? Is that the right way to think about it?
I think that's part of the explanation, but it's by no means the entire explanation. I think one of the things that I really stress in the book is that continuity of the older forms of anti-Judaism, and that you can't only identify it with American populism.
How much of the anti-Judaism do you feel like is coursing through present-day anti-Semitism?
I think that it's a very significant component of present-day anti-Semitism, because we have calls, and in this moment, we have calls to make America a Christian nation. And one of the things that I wrote about in the book is I wrote about during the Civil War, so now back to your period that you like so much, the 19th century.
I like all your periods, Pam.
Yeah. But during the Civil War, Congress for the first time considers the introduction of an amendment to amend the Constitution to recognize the Lord Jesus Christ as the Savior, or recognized in the Constitution, the language. And then there's this organization that keeps calling for a constitutional amendment to recognize America as a Christian nation. And that organization doesn't completely disappear until 1950. Is it very significant in American history? No. Was that amendment ever likely to pass? No. But I don't know. Could we be in a moment where things would change and that could pass now? I have no idea.
Is that anti-Judaism something that's only present in the right-wing variants of anti-Semitism, or does it manifest itself at all in any of the left-wing variants?
I don't think that form of anti-Judaism.
No, but is there like some, in the way that anti-Judaism, in David Nurnberg's excellent book, Anti-Judaism, he describes anti-Judaism as anything that makes the Jews a villainous force that needs to be overcome, and that it's all kind of borrowing in some sort of ecumenical way from the same vocabulary, the same set of imagery, the same sets of traditions.
Yeah, but what he also writes about is the way in which different political voices, different religious voices are calling their enemies, the Jews, to justify their own position. And I don't see that kind of anti-Judaism coming from the left, because the left's so secular. So I don't see that particular form. But what I do see are the conspiracy theories that are coming out, right?
Right. I want to keep going this, but before we do, the Black Jewish story is part of your book as well, and it feels like something that we need to address. As you go and you study the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s especially. What did you learn about, as you're looking at these instances of Black anti-Semitism, what do you feel like you understand more about it now that would help us understand it?
What I understand more about it now is the role that Israel played in it. I think there was Black anti-Semitism before 1967, by and large, was based on the sense of Jews as exploiters of African Americans in the neighborhoods that they'd abandoned. It was an economic conflict, and it was there were lots of things that were going on. I do talk about the riots from the 60s, but 1967 is a real turning point because it's the moment where Stokely Carmichael and Martin Luther King split, right? And Carmichael, he moves to Black Power, and Black Power means pushing away whites, but it also, they use the Six-Day War to denounce Israel in really anti-Semitic terms, and that then becomes more and more amplified in among certain sectors of the African American experience.
To some extent, is that the current that's still? I mean, it's no longer necessarily a Black thing, a Black strain. It's more, it's broadened out, but that is essentially the strain that's with us now.
It's a strain that's with us now. It's a strain that some observers of anti-Semitism by the early 70s were saying, first of all, that the golden age had ended, and they're also saying they were calling it the new anti-Semitism. Is it new? It's new because it's focused on Israel, but it's not new.
Right.
That's how they shaped it.
So you've already said that you began working on this in 2018.
Right.
So 2018, you're watching this recent chapter, the last chapter in your book unfolds as you're writing the book. Yeah. What was that like?
Writing the last chapter was the hardest chapter to write. It's called A New Litany, Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Poe, Jersey City, and then October 7th. And it's because it was so hard to write because like you said, I'm living through it. I've been living through it, for much of my academic career. And it's also, the violence was so shocking, right? What really made us think about anti-Semitism, I think, in new ways in American life was the violence and the open public displays of hate. So things that people used to, at least people of a certain level of breeding, would never say. They might think, or they might say it among certain groups, but they would never say it out loud and wide public. All of a sudden, they could say things like that, and it became anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic expression, and then ultimately anti-Semitic violence became normalized in a way that nobody expected.
I want to unpack all of this, because let's start with the normalization. What do you you're saying that anti-Semitism is now more normalized than it's been since
late 50s, early 50s.
And when you, as a historian, instead of processing this with in the fevered way that we journalists tend to process things, or in the kind of the personal way that a lot of Jews inevitably process events and filter them through the history of our people, and as a historian, as you've processed normalization, what have you come to understand about that? So
you were talking about my writing this in 2018, and or starting to work on this in 2018. And as a historian, even though anti-Semitism apparently appears, well, it does appear in every chapter of my last book, but it was a small part of the story, right? And then after 2018, and I begin to think about this, it becomes a larger part of my story. And one of the things that happened is I was out on book tour and I started to ask people in my audience, because you know I like to ask questions too, I asked people, did you ever experience anti-Semitism? And the stories that poured out with anger and anguish and with a level of detail, sometimes stories of events that had happened 50 years before, shocked me. And so I began to understand, and I think it's one of the things that's unusual about this book, is how anti-Semitism affects Jews. So it doesn't matter at our moment in time, and you know, when I'm writing the section of the book where people are trying to parse the lines between, you know, is it anti-Zionist, is that anti-Semitism? My response to that is, it doesn't really matter what the other person is saying, it matters how the Jews internalize it. And so I am convinced, as somebody who has read a whole bunch of those anti-Semitism reports coming out of the various task forces with lists of what young Jewish students have faced on their campuses, I bet somebody 50 years from now is going to ask them, did they ever face anti-Semitism? And those stories are going to pour out.
All right, at this stage, we're going to pass around note cards, or we're going to collect note cards that you have already been distributed with your non-polemical, highly intelligent questions written on them. And while those are being collected and sorted through, I'll ask them. But I wanted to know, is it comforting to know that this is an American tradition on some level, or is it deeply unnerving? Because just personally, I find like I had a view of America that was maybe a little bit rosier than the picture that emerges in this book. But at the same time, I think that there's maybe part of me that feels like, okay, we've been here before. Maybe we're not permanently running off course. Maybe there's a way for us to correct and repair and rebuild and heal and improve as a nation.
So we're living in a moment where historical institutions are being told that they need to write a patriotic history. And the Smithsonian is having all of its labels reviewed, and things that don't fit into a particular patriotic narrative are being pulled out. I think this is a patriotic history. I think it's a history that tells the story of one aspect of this nation's past that we've overlooked, we minimize because we could sit in amazing institutions like this, the Center for Jewish History, and bypass them. It's not the only story of the American Jewish experience, but it's one that needs to be told.
Okay. All right. All right, so this question is oh, thank you. All right. This question is asking essentially, you know, like assimilation, success, like do they, you know, you would think that they would deflect from anti-Semitism, but they apparently haven't, and why not?
They deflected during the period of the Golden Age. They certainly deflected. I think one of the characteristics of that era is that really surprised me when I was writing, is how anxious American Jews remained at the end of the 20th century about how much anti-Semitism would affect them in the 21st century. And I think that the reason they did that was because of what they were looking at that was around them. Oh, Andrew has one for you. So one of the things that I thought about was, what were American Jews thinking about? Where was their activism in the 20th century during the Golden Age, when assimilation and success?
It was a Golden Age, huh?
So, let them first of all enter into the mainstream of American society, and then also let them begin to act in ways they hadn't before. So what were they worried about? They were worried about the Holocaust. They were building the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and Holocaust institutions around the country. They were bringing home Soviet Jews, and they were worried about the existence of Israel. And all three of those have elements of anti-Semitism in their stories. So what American Jews were focused on was they were focused on anti-Semitism. They just were not so focused at home, which is maybe why they remained so anxious about it at the end of the century.
There's a question about Gaza.
Right.
And the question is there a way in which conflicts in Israel, Palestine, Gaza spike anti-Semitism? And what does that tell us about the nature of American anti-Semitism?
What it tells us about the nature of American anti-Semitism is how deeply intertwined the situation of American Jews remains with, or is connected to events that are happening in the Middle East, in Israel, and in Palestine. And we know that in other moments when there has been conflict in Gaza, that it has skyrocketed. So I think of, when was the last war there? 2021?
2021.
Yeah, 2021, when there was the attack on the Jews eating at the kosher restaurant in Los Angeles. And anti-Semitism, so physical attacks, anti-Semitism skyrockets. So there remains that powerful connection. What happens in Israel doesn't stay only in Israel and in Palestine. It affects the American Jewish community.
A question asks, do you believe the intervention of a presidential administration in defining and monitoring anti-Semitism is new?
In defining and monitoring anti-Semitism is new. The Biden administration passed the first plan ever to combat anti-Semitism in American life. Didn't get enforced, not very much happened as a result of it. But the moment we're in where the administration is using anti-Semitism to attack all sorts of aspects of American life, especially colleges and universities, is usually problematic because, frankly, canceling my daughter's cancer research grant at Harvard is not going to solve the problem of anti-Semitism.
Do you think it'll make it worse? Not canceling your daughter's grant per se. But
Right. I am convinced. So I think I'd mentioned to you that I have a piece that will come out in Liberal Education magazine, published by the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and I am convinced that if what happens is as a result of the huge transformation in terms of how research in the universities will be funded, if that leads to, as it looks like it will, the diminishment of the prestige and the abilities to conduct research of American colleges and universities, that in the end, it will be bad for the Jews because the Jews will have been blamed for those cuts.
What role has Donald Trump and MAGA played in normalizing anti-Semitism?
So it's really fascinating to me that the anti-Semitism, so right now everybody's been focused on the anti-Semitism on the left, but about a year ago, 3 New York Times investigative journalists published a fabulous piece that they worked on for a long time on the extent to which American political leaders, including President Trump, amplified classic anti-Semitic tropes, especially around globalism and especially around George Soros. And they had fabulous statistics about this. And what is part of the issue of anti-Semitism being normalized in American life, and also in many ways a throwback to the period, the other period you like, the 1930s, when you heard much of this discourse also coming from certain members of Congress.
This is a question that I think is pretty interesting. It asks, what developments would cause you to leave America because of anti-Semitism?
So, first of all, it's an important question. A recent Pew survey of the American Jewish community actually asked if American Jews had, what percentage of American Jews have been having conversations about whether or not they would leave. And so you're asking me personally. So now I'm thinking of like German Jews, right? I'm at the age where it would be really hard and really difficult to start elsewhere. But if my children and grandchildren were threatened, I would go with them.
As a historian answering this question, we're answering it comparatively, not just comparatively against American history, but comparatively in a global sense. Would you think that based on objective facts, we're anywhere close to the type of moment where people should be considering migration?
No, I don't think we're there. I mean, first of all, it's back to the kinds of stories that we American Jewish historians were telling before 2018, and we're still writing those books about where American Jews are integrated and successful and how they live their lives in different places and the industries they make impacts on. So we're not going to see a return. I don't expect to see a return to the structural discriminations that existed in the 20s and 30s. I don't think that's going to happen. And as long as we can continue to by and large, live our lives out, we will continue to do so here. But what is it, 3/4 of American Jews hide their Jewish identity? I told you the story earlier. My son calls me. I call him on the eve of Rosh Hashanah this year. He's in an Uber on his way home to be with his family. I say on the phone, Shana Tova. He says, you too. The next day he calls me to apologize because he didn't say Shana Tova. And he said, Mom, I was in an Uber. I can't say that in an Uber. And that is the moment we are in now, where we are very, very careful when we are out somewhere and we don't want to be seen as Jewish. And the Orthodox Jews, they've known about the physical attacks for ages.
I mean, obviously that anecdote carries enormous emotional punch, but then what you said before that also to me carries enormous strategic punch, which is that even if we are in something that historians will regard as a 1930s level of anti-Semitism, comparatively, globally, it's not actually time to pack your bags and leave. And I think that maybe that's also a message that Jews need to hear, because all the scary aspects of anti-Semitism are, they cloud the brain, they produce anxiety, and anxiety is the enemy of strategic thinking.
So that we stay, right?
But it's not just that we stay, but I think you're pointing to something really, the benefit of the historian's eye is that we can actually keep things in proper context.
Right. We can read this tradition against the other successes in American life.
Right. And it strikes me that one of the perils of the moment is that we let emotion prevent us from thinking strategically about how to get ourselves out of this mess.
And that we are in the process of trying to do that, and that's why there are all these Jewish organizations now working on this. We'll never completely solve the problem. The question is, can we somehow mitigate it?
And we're going to close, but let me just, happily we have 5 more minutes. Let's just pivot then to the kind of working our way out of this.
Okay.
Historically, when periods of anti-Semitism have abated, what happens?
What happens is the wider culture calms down. So if I think about the difference between the World War II period, 30s, pre-war, 30s and the 40s, and then moving into the 50s, the 1950s are a period of tremendous consensus in American life. Now, part of that consensus is driven by the fact that many people think that there's going to be a nuclear war and everybody's going to die and there's a Cold War going on. But in terms of American life, it's a period of economic prosperity. It's a period where, while there's persecution, the Red Scare is going on at that moment in time, but that's seen as one element of American society that they're dealing with, albeit in a terrible way. And then there's the elevation of Christianity and religion in American life, and Jews are building synagogues and they're moving to the suburbs, and they feel like they've arrived, and then the structural discriminations against the Jews fall. So it's a period where anti-Semitism is tamped down. Also in part because American Jews have allies in terms of the government. The various laws are enacted to the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and the Fair Employment Acts. And so there's a change and anti-Semitism declines. The problem now is, how can it possibly decline? So where are the spaces where that decline could take place? But since it's rising on the right and it's rising on the left, and social media is a disaster for anti-Semitism, I'm not sure how it's going to be tamped down now.
So absent an existential threat that scares people into behaving tolerantly, it felt like, though you were embedded in what you just said, there were also affirmative stories about the way in which society was changing. It wasn't, I mean, who am I to tell a historian? It's like, it's a confluence of many factors, but it also sounded like, in addition to the external just calming down and cooling off and all these other things that happened in the 1950s, there are movements that are developing, Jewish movements developing to change American life that played some positive role in eliminating not just structural barriers to Jewish inclusion in American society, but to playing a role in tamping and curbing anti-Semitism.
Right. So the great Jewish writers of that era, some of the stories that are told on screen, for example, in American culture in the 50s and the 60s, become really powerful and have a way of bringing the Jewish story more into the mainstream. And so some of us were talking earlier, we were, in the 90s, what were the TV shows that you could watch on TV, right? Seinfeld, The Nanny. And so they're telling stories that I don't think you can tell today. Not on American television.
Did The Nanny help curb anti-Semitism or contribute? No. We know.
So I have to tell you a funny story. So I had broken my arm, and I talked to Deborah Lipstadt, the ambassador, and one day she calls me up and she says, "You have to watch The Nanny." I'd never seen it, right? I had little kids in the 90s. I never watched television. The portrayals of Jews in that show and of Jewish culture are so sympathetic. And so they say the 4 questions, and they have the Hanukkah blessings. And there's certainly a conversation about the stereotypes being elevated in that show, but also there was something very warm about that show, and also about Seinfeld, that you just can't do now, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it reminds me, I love the image of Deborah Lipstadt calling you and talking to you about The Nanny. That's how those conversations always go.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Christopher Hitchens once described to me about how he went to see E.T. with Susan Sontag and she cried, and that's kind of like the Jewish version of that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, we've reached the end of our journey. I think you were going to be signing books out there. Everybody should buy the book and buy it for their kids and buy it for their grandkids, because this is something we confront and we need to understand. And it's the historian's job to stare bravely at the American past and not just tell the just so story or the gauzy tale, but to tell it like it is. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.